Hello, everyone, and welcome to Africafé. Today, we're diving into a subject that has dominated headlines and policy debates across the continent, and that is the evolving nature of Russian influence in Africa, particularly in terms of information and media. To help us unpack the complexities behind this rhetoric, I am joined by a special guest, Thomas Kent. Thomas is a senior fellow for strategic communication at the American Foreign Policy Council. He analyzes Russian propaganda, the mechanics of the global information war, and media ethics. And he is also a professor at Columbia University. Thomas, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's nice to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's get right into the heart of this. Moscow's footprint in Africa has been rising a lot recently. And we see its insecurity pacts, but we also see it in information. What do you think is at the core of their narrative, and why is it appealing to African audiences so much?
Well, the core of their narrative is a very strong anti-Western bias. And this is something that, of course, is not new. They've been taking this position for a long time, and it's the central focus of what they're doing. Obviously, in Africa, there is a lot of anti-Western feeling as a result of colonialism and unbalanced economic relations ever since then. So the Russians know about that, and they use it to their advantage.
Yeah. Do you think that perhaps Western countries laid the ground for this kind of narrative to take over because of, you mentioned some of the things about colonialism and unfair, perhaps, economic relations. In the recent years, do you think that this gap has widened because of a intentional retreat by Western countries?
Well, I think Western countries have retreated to some degree in Africa. Some of it is in terms of finances, that Western countries are giving less aid to Africa. But on the other hand, there are many Africans who think that aid just leads to more and more dependence and are looking for other kinds of relationships than just aid relationships.
Yeah, and they're not only looking at Russia, they're also looking at other countries. I'm curious about a particular region. We see the Russian influence in various regions of Africa, Central African Republic, in the Sahel. Particularly in the Sahel, we saw a movement of, asking the Western countries to leave, closing the military bases, and kicking out the French. Do you think that Russia is perhaps an accidental beneficiary of these regime changes, or if it is actively perhaps participating in bringing out these outcomes?
Well, I think they would like to think that they were active in these outcomes, and they probably did everything they could. But ultimately, I don't think it was them. It was France and the perception of France in these countries. Whether that was justified or not, I don't know. But the countries certainly have a feeling that France has not been their friend, that France has supported all sorts of dictatorial and corrupt governments, that France has not been successful in fighting terrorism, and therefore they were open to other alternatives. And Russia's always there as an alternative.
Yeah. Just yesterday, I was watching a documentary about the Russian influence, and they were talking about how certain, private military contractors and stuff are more they're more concrete in their help of African armies. Do you think this is a way that how are these groups being portrayed in the Russian media in Africa?
In the Russian media, they're portrayed as heroes, that these are our people. They used to be private organizations completely, like the Wagner Group, but a lot of them have now been incorporated officially into the Russian Defense Ministry, and they're portrayed as heroes who are helping Africa fight terrorists. Their means are fairly aggressive, more aggressive than Western forces, and you can have your own opinion about that. Some people think that Western forces were too gentle, too focused on human rights. The Russians have a different perspective, and some of these Russian fighters have been making videos that are sort of like the videos you would see from ISIS, beheading people and extreme violence and so forth. But they feel that it works. Doesn't always work. They've had some trouble in Mali and other places, but they have this very aggressive approach to fighting terrorism that's different from the general Western approach.
And perhaps this is making people feel like there's going to be an outcome, that maybe there's going to be concrete changes with these Russian groups.
Well, people may feel very optimistic about the chances that Russian forces will be able to accomplish what Western forces haven't. We will see. At the moment, it's not really clear.
Yeah, so far we haven't really seen that impact on the ground. You mentioned the videos and videos similar to the beheadings that ISIS would put on social media. Social media is a very interesting breeding ground for some of this information warfare, let's say. How do you think Russia has been utilizing these platforms in order to convey its messages?
They've really been effective. They have whole organizations of people whose job is to try to dominate social media in given countries, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's on TikTok or other places. They have very carefully studied the algorithms that make social media work. They use local languages. They have influencers. They're pro-Russian influencers in many parts of Africa, and they use all of this together to try to have a real big imprint on social media.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think they're also maybe focusing on bringing more foreign students and maybe hiring these students after their graduation from Russian universities to work for these news outlets. How is Russia also using maybe these exchanges or other sectors in order to promote its agenda?
Right. They have all sorts of news organizations, RT television, for example, Sputnik, African Initiative, and they're very happy to hire Africans to work for these organizations and to inculcate in them the Russian view of journalism and what journalism should be. So they offer jobs at these networks. They offer all sorts of training. As you said, they bring African students to Russia. And particularly, as we know, in recent months, they've been interested in bringing Africans to Russia to fight in Ukraine.
Okay. What makes an African citizen want to go to Ukraine to fight for Russia?
Well, many of them have no idea that they're going to Russia to fight in Ukraine. They think they're going to Russia to learn how to be an electrician or how to be a security guard or something. And then there's a surprise. Once they get there, there's a document they sign in Russian, and voila, they're at the front.
Wow, that's very interesting. I have another question about, many African countries are historical allies with Russia. It's a country that has supported a lot of independence movements. This is one thing that they try to utilize in order to sort of inflame this anti-Western narrative. Do you think that this, holds weight today, this history? Or maybe it's just a tactic?
Well, I think it holds weight to some degree. Everybody knows that Russia was really active in supporting national liberation movements in Africa through the whole Soviet period. And people associate, obviously, Russia with the Soviet Union. After the end of the Soviet Union, Russian interest in Africa declined extremely sharply. It pretty much disappeared. And then with the start of the Putin administration after 2000, they began to really rev everything up again and try to become extremely active. But they had disappeared for a while. In terms of its impact, I think it's probably limited at this point. Africa is a very young continent, as you know, and very few people remember that period. But from a political standpoint, historical standpoint, it's true that the Russians did a lot, and it's still remembered by many.
Yeah. I want to know, what the concrete political and economic consequences are of this pivots, from Western allies to Russian allies for these African countries where, there's growing popularity of Moscow's, ideas.
Well, we have to be sure to maybe not exaggerate the the popularity. And you'll see sometimes a photo of people in one of the Sahel countries or another country holding up Russian flags. I mean, are they really thinking about Russia, or did someone just give them a flag to hold up? This is a way of really scaring Western countries, maybe encouraging them to provide more aid or to be more cooperative with Sahel countries. So this is sort of
some hedging,
a scare tactic, a hedging
yeah.
that they do. But ultimately, economically, the Russians are not very active economically in Africa. They have a few projects, usually mineral extraction projects, but their trade with Africa is extremely low. It's much less than Chinese trade. It's much less than Western trade. On the whole, Russia is not a big economic factor.
I'm glad that you got into this. This brings us to my next point, which is: are we exaggerating and overstating Russia's actual reach, or maybe are we underestimating its long-term strategic game?
I think we tend to overestimate it a bit. I mean, there is a whole Western disinformation industrial complex that spends all its time publishing big reports about Russian disinformation. And certainly there's enough to see. You can see all sorts of Russian organizations and influencers and overt and covert activity directed at Africans. But after a while, you have to wonder what the impact is. My impression, traveling through Africa and quite a number of countries, is that people are interested mainly in their own countries and their own governments and corruption locally and governance and freedoms locally. If they're angry at their governments, then obviously they might view Russia as an ally, particularly if those governments are supported by Western countries. But it's kind of an incidental ally. I don't think people think a lot about Russia. It's sort of a faraway place, and maybe someone went there and visited there or studied there. In 2018, they had the World Cup there, and that brought them some good publicity. But I don't think it's a daily thing. I always ask people, well, what do you think about Russia? And usually there's a long silence, and they sort of grope for something to say.
Yeah. That's wonderful answer. Thank you very much for this incredible conversation. Is there anything else you would like to add in order to, help our audiences understand this topic more deeply?
I think it would just be good if there were more people in Africa who knew about Russia, who had a better idea of Russian goals and Russian strategies, and to understand that Russia has its own objectives in Africa, that what you see is not necessarily what you get, and that it's important to demonstrate in dealing with Russian officials, with Russian companies and so forth, that you have a clear idea of what their actual objectives are.
Thank you very much, Professor Kentz. This has been a wonderful conversation. And to our audiences, please check out our website, the Policy Center for the New South, in order to see more episodes of Africafé.